The moment Alpha King Ronan unrolled the 30-year-old treaty, the ink-stained handprint of a child stared up from the vellum, and the forgotten scribe beside him whispered a single, impossible sentence. She was Verity, a woman of dust and records, invisible to the court that had long ago discarded her family. He was the Iron Wolf of the North, a ruler whose hands were stained with the blood of his enemies, not the ink of scholars. There was no reason for him to be in her archives, and no reason for her to speak to him at all. But his wolf, the beast that had slept in restless silence for a decade, was suddenly awake, clawing at the inside of his skin, because it smelled a truth his mind could not yet grasp. If you believe that a single moment of being truly seen can rewrite a lifetime of being invisible, type Y, see you below, and let me tell you what happened next. To understand how she got there, you have to understand the silence of the archives. The great archives of the Blackwood Hold were not a library. Libraries were for reading, for leisure, for the sons and daughters of the landed pack lords. The archives were a tomb. Here, the history of the northern packs was interred in scrolls of vellum and parchment, bound in leather that cracked at the touch, and sealed with wax emblems that had not seen the light of day in 100 winters. And Verity was its keeper, or more accurately, its ghost. She had been given the post 10 years ago, not as an honor, but as a quiet dismissal. Her family, the House of Scribes, had once been esteemed. They had been the memory of the pack, their hands shaping the laws and treaties that held the territory together. But her parents had died in a fever that swept the lower hold, and with no powerful allies to speak for her, the role of chief scribe had passed to a rival house. Verity, then just a girl of 16, was given the archives, a place no one else wanted. It was a cold, sprawling labyrinth of stone shelves beneath the main fortress, smelling perpetually of dust, decaying paper, and the damp chill of the mountain. In the beginning, she had wept. The silence was a physical weight, the dust a constant shroud. But Verity was her parents' daughter. She had ink in her veins, and so she began to work. She learned the language of the dust, the stories told in the fading script. She brought order to the chaos, creating her own system of cataloging that existed only in her head. The archives became her world, and she its sole, unseen inhabitant. The world outside went on without her. Lords and ladies came and went from the great hall. Wars were fought and won on the borders, and through it all, Alpha King Ronan ruled. She rarely saw him. A glimpse from a high window as his procession rode out. A dark figure on the dais during the winter solstice feast, which she was permitted to attend, but never expected to enjoy. He was a presence more than a man, a force of nature carved into the shape of a king. His hair was the color of a winter sky at dusk. His eyes a piercing, pale gray that saw everything and revealed nothing. They called him the Iron Wolf. He had taken the throne 30 years ago, in the midst of the gray fur wars, and had forged a peace with fire and steel. He was hard, unyielding, and utterly alone. It was whispered he had no heart, that the wolf inside him had long ago consumed the man. It was known he had never found his mate, and at his age, now past 50 winters, no one expected him to. Verity knew the stories. In her archives, she held the records of his battles, the pacts he had sealed, the death warrants he had signed. She knew the man through his deeds, through the stark, black ink of his signature. And it was a signature she had come to dread, for it always meant another piece of history to be filed away, another memory of violence to be buried in her silent world. The day it all changed began with a shouting. The sound was so alien in her quiet domain that Verity dropped a bundle of tax records, sending a puff of century-old dust into the air. It was coming from the stairwell, the heavy, angry tones of pack lords. She froze, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. No one ever came down here. No one. She retreated, melting into the shadows between two towering shelves of land deeds. The heavy oak door at the top of the stone stairs crashed open, and the sound of heavy boots echoed down into the cold. Light, raw and yellow from a carried lantern, sliced through the gloom. "It has to be here," a gravelly voice boomed. It was Lord Kalin, the Alpha's war master. "The treaty with the Silver Creek Pact. The original." The last scribe to hold this post was a drunkard and a fool. Another voice, smoother but just as irritated, replied. Lord Bryce, head of the council. He likely used it to light his pipe. Verity's hands tightened into fists. That was a lie. The old scribe, for all his faults, had been meticulous. She knew exactly where the Silver Creek treaties were. Section 4, Shelf 12, north-facing wall. Then a third voice cut through the others, and the archives fell into a sudden, absolute silence. It was a voice that needed no volume to command. It was low, cold, and carried the weight of the mountain itself. "Find it." Alpha King Ronan. Verity's breath caught in her throat. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, making herself smaller, as if she could will herself into the stone. The Alpha himself was here, in her archives. It was unthinkable. The lantern light swung wildly as the lords began their clumsy search, pulling scrolls from shelves at random, their frustration mounting with every passing second. The air grew thick with their impatience, the scent of their agitation sharp and predatory. "This is a fool's errand," Kalin growled, tossing a scroll onto a table. It unrolled with a crackle, a delicate map of the Eastern Territories. "We have until moonrise." Ronan's voice was flat, a statement of fact that held more threat than any shout. "If we cannot produce the original pact, the Silver Creeks will claim the sunken valley. They will see it as a sign of weakness, and the other border pacts will follow. 30 years of peace undone by a lost piece of paper." Verity's mind raced. The sunken valley. She knew the treaty. It wasn't about land. It was a blood pact, a promise of mutual defense sealed after the war. The valley was just the territory marker. To break the pact was to declare war. These fools, in their arrogance, were about to stumble into a conflict that could cost thousands of lives. She couldn't let that happen. The history she guarded was not just paper and ink. It was lives, promises, peace. Taking a breath that felt like swallowing broken glass, she stepped out from the shadows. "You are looking in the wrong section," she said. Her voice was a small thing in the vast, cold space, rusty from disuse. But it cut through the tension like a knife. 3 sets of powerful, predatory eyes snapped to her. The 2 lords looked at her with pure shock, as if a mouse had just offered them strategic advice. But Ronan's gaze was different. His pale gray eyes narrowed, not with surprise, but with a sudden, intense focus. It was like being pinned by a hawk. For the first time, Verity felt the full, crushing weight of his presence. He was bigger than she'd imagined, a wall of muscle and authority packed into a frame of disciplined stillness. Heat radiated from him, a stark contrast to the archive's chill. "Who are you?" Lord Bryce demanded, recovering first. "She is the keeper," Ronan said, his voice quiet, almost thoughtful. He hadn't taken his eyes off her. It felt as if he were seeing something more than just a dusty woman in a plain gray dress. Verity ignored the lords, her gaze fixed on the Alpha. The Silver Creek pacts are with the other post-war treaties. To the north. I can show you. She turned without waiting for permission and led the way, her small tallow lamp a flickering star in the oppressive dark. She could feel their eyes on her back, could hear the soft tread of the Alpha's boots behind her, a sound that was unnervingly silent for such a large man. She stopped before a towering wall of shelves, running her hand along the carved wooden markers she had made herself. Section 4, Shelf 12. Her fingers found the right scroll almost by instinct. It was bound not in leather, but in a simple linen ribbon, the seal a plain, unadorned drop of black wax. She turned and held it out. Lord Kalin reached for it, but Ronan's hand shot out, not touching the Lord but stopping him with sheer presence. No. The Alpha stepped forward, his body eclipsing the lantern light, plunging them into a momentary darkness. He took the scroll from Verity's hand, his fingers brushed against hers, and a jolt, sharp and electric, shot up her arm. It was like touching a live current, a blast of heat and raw power that made her gasp. His eyes, which had been pale gray, were suddenly shot through with flecks of gold. They burned. He seemed just as startled as she was. He looked down at their hands, then back to her face, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression. Confusion? Recognition? He turned away abruptly, breaking the contact. The air rushed back into Verity's lungs. He walked to the large oak table where Kalin had tossed the map, setting the scroll down carefully. The other lords hovered, their earlier arrogance replaced by a tense curiosity. "Give me the lantern," Ronan commanded, and Kalin immediately handed it over. With deliberate, careful movements, Ronan broke the 30-year-old seal. The wax crumbled to dust. He unrolled the vellum, the parchment crackling in the profound silence of the archive. The lantern light fell upon the elegant script of his father, the old Alpha, and the cruder, heavier script of the Silver Creek chieftain. "There," Ronan said, his finger tracing a line of text. "As we knew, the valley is ours, but the pact of defense is tied to it." He read on, his voice a low murmur. Verity watched him, her hand still tingling from his touch. She knew what he was looking for. The witness marks. At the bottom of the scroll, below the two main signatures, were the affirmations, the seal of the War Master, the seal of the head scribe of that time. And something else. A small, crude handprint, pressed into a pool of black ink. A child's handprint, a symbol of the future, a promise that the peace would extend to the next generation. Ronan stared at that small handprint, a frown creasing his brow. A child's mark. Whose? And that's when Verity saw it. She knew every line of that pact, had studied it a dozen times, but she had never seen it by the raw, living light of a lantern, held in the hands of the Alpha King himself. She had only ever seen it on her dusty table, under the weak glow of her own lamp. In the flickering, dancing light, she saw what she had never seen before, a tiny, almost invisible scar that ran along the edge of the palm, a faint white line against the black ink. A scar she knew intimately, a scar she saw every single day. A tremor went through her. The world seemed to tilt, the stone shelves swaying. The past, a thing she had curated and kept at arm's length, was suddenly, violently present. Without thinking, without even being aware that she was speaking, the words came out of her, a whisper that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. That hand. she breathed, her own hand rising, pale and trembling in the lantern light. That hand was mine. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a living thing, thick with shock and disbelief. The two lords stared at her as if she had sprouted a second head, but Ronan did not look at her. His gaze was locked on the vellum, on the child's handprint, and then it lifted slowly to her own hand, still held out in the space between them. He saw the faint, silvery line of the scar on her palm, a mirror image of the one preserved in ink for 30 years. For a long moment, he was utterly still, a predator that has caught a scent so impossible, so world-altering, that it freezes. The air around him grew thick, shimmering with a heat that had nothing to do with the lantern. His eyes, when they finally lifted to meet hers, were no longer gray. They were molten gold. The wolf was at the surface, looking out at her not with aggression, but with a dawning, terrible, and beautiful recognition. He took a step toward her, and the lords instinctively took a step back. The scent in the room changed. The old smells of dust and decay were burned away by something primal and overwhelming. Pine smoke, winter frost, and the clean, sharp scent of a wolf. His scent. And underneath it, something else was unfurling in the air. The scent of rain-washed stone and night-blooming flowers. Her scent. A scent he should not have been able to detect. He knew that child. He had been there that day, a young, newly crowned alpha, his father forcing him to witness the tedious sealing of peace. He remembered a solemn little girl with dark braids and serious eyes, the daughter of the head scribe, who had been told to put her hand on the treaty. A symbol. He hadn't thought of her since, but his wolf had that faint, elusive scent that had haunted the edges of his senses for years. A scent he thought was a ghost, a memory of a mate he would never find. It was her. It had always been her, hidden away, buried under layers of dust and grief and loneliness. Her scent had been too faint for him to trace. Until now. Now, with her standing before him, her identity crashing into him like a tidal wave, the scent was a roaring fire. "You," he breathed. The word was not a question. It was an accusation, a revelation, a prayer. He closed the distance between them in 2 silent strides. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take her hand. He turned it over, his thumb tracing the scar on her palm. His touch was no longer a jolt of electricity. It was a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through her entire being, settling in her bones. It felt like coming home to a place she had never been. "Verity," he said, her name a forgotten word on his tongue. He knew her name. He knew her house. He had signed the order that relegated her to this tomb. The thought was a spike of ice in his gut. "My king," she whispered, her voice trembling. She didn't know what was happening, only that the most powerful, dangerous man in the territories was holding her hand as if it were a precious, fragile artifact, and his eyes were burning her to the soul. "What is the meaning of this?" Lord Bryce sputtered, finding his voice. "Ronan, she is a scribe. The girl is overwrought." Ronan's head snapped toward the Lord, and for the first time, Verity saw the unbridled fury of the iron wolf. His eyes blazed, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Bryce physically recoiled, his face paling. "She is not the girl," Ronan snarled, his voice a blade of ice. "She is the daughter of the House of Scribes. She is the witness to this pact, and you will show her the respect she is due." He did not release Verity's hand. Instead, his grip tightened, not painfully, but possessively. He turned his burning gaze back to her. "You will come with me." It was not a request. I cannot leave the archives," she stammered, the familiar panic of her responsibilities rising. "There is no one else." "The archives can fall to dust for all I care," he said, his voice softer now, for her alone. "You are coming with me." He tugged gently on her hand, and her feet, as if they had a will of their own, obeyed. He led her from the table, past the stunned lords, and toward the stone steps. He still held the lantern, and its light cast their joined shadows against the ancient walls, a giant wolf leading a slender, startled woman out of the darkness. As they reached the base of the stairs, he paused and looked back at his council. "Seal the archives," he commanded. "No one enters until I say so. And send word to the Silver Creeks. Tell them I will meet them at moonrise, and I will be bringing the witness to the original pact." Then he turned and led her up the stairs, out of the cold, silent world that had been her prison and her sanctuary for a decade, and into the light. The journey through the keep was a blur to Verity. Servants and guards flattened themselves against the walls as the Alpha King strode through the corridors, his face a mask of thunderous purpose, holding the hand of a dusty, bewildered scribe. Whispers followed them like the rustling of dry leaves. He did not take her to the great hall or the council chambers. He led her up, past the floors of the pack lords, past the guest wings, up a winding stone staircase she had never been allowed to use. This was the East Tower, the Alpha's private domain. He brought her to a heavy, iron-banded door and pushed it open. He led her inside and then, to her shock, he closed the door behind them, shutting out the rest of the world. She stood in the center of a vast, circular room. A fire roared in a stone hearth large enough to roast an ox. Furs were piled on chairs and draped over a massive bed carved from a single oak tree. The walls were not stone, but dark, polished wood, lined with weapons and maps. The air smelled of wood smoke, leather, and him. It was the most intensely masculine room she had ever seen. It was his den. He finally released her hand, and the loss of his warmth was immediate and jarring. She instinctively wrapped her arms around herself. He stood watching her, his golden eyes tracking her every movement. The fury he had shown his lords was gone, replaced by an unnerving stillness. He seemed to be fighting some great battle within himself, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "Why did you never come to me?" he asked, his voice raw. Verity blinked. "Come to you? My king, I am a scribe. I keep the records. I have no reason to." "No reason?" He took a step closer, his presence filling the room, sucking the air from her lungs. "Your family served the Alpha's line for 200 years. Your father was my father's most trusted advisor. When they died, you were left an orphan. Did you think we had forgotten you?" Bitterness, sharp and unwelcome, rose in her throat. "It was my understanding that the council found a new House of Scribes. I was given the archives. It was a provision." She said the word with all the cold formality she had been shown. A look of profound self-loathing crossed his face. "A provision," he repeated, the words tasting like ash. "I signed that order. I was at war. My father was dead. The pack was fractured. Bryce said you would be cared for, that the archives were an honorable post for a girl of your lineage. I did not question it. I did not look. I buried myself in battle and duty, and I left a child to be forgotten in my own basement. The raw pain in his voice stunned her. This was not the iron wolf of the stories. This was a man drowning in a regret 30 years deep. "It was not your fault," she found herself saying, the words automatic. "Wasn't it?" he shot back, his eyes flashing. "I am the Alpha King. Everything that happens in this hold is my fault. Everything." He paced before the fire, a caged wolf. "For 10 years," he tashed, his back to her, "I have felt a pull, a thread. So faint I thought I was going mad. A scent I could never place. I would catch it in the corridors late at night. A ghost of a fragrance. I thought it was a memory of someone long dead. I tore this keep apart looking for its source. I sealed wings, moved courts. Nothing worked." He turned to face her, his eyes full of a desperate, dawning wonder. "It was you, it was always you. Down there in the dust and the cold, your scent, our bond. It was too weak, muffled. But it was there. My wolf knew. He knew, and he has been clawing at me to find you." Verity's head was spinning. "Bond? Scent? I don't understand. What bond?" He closed the space between them again, stopping just inches from her. He lifted a hand, hesitating for a moment, before gently touching her cheek. His fingers were calloused and warm, and where they touched, her skin bloomed with heat. "The mate bond, Verity," he whispered, his voice full of a reverence she could not comprehend. "The one thing a wolf lives for, the other half of his soul. You are my mate." The words hung in the air between them, impossible. Her? A mate to the Alpha King? The overlooked, forgotten scribe? The world tilted on its axis and spun. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. That's not possible. Mates they are chosen. They are equals, powerful. I am nothing. I am a keeper of dust." "You are not nothing!" The roar was back, but it was laced with pain, not anger. "You are the heir to a house that held the secrets of this pack for centuries. You are the woman whose scent has been driving me to the brink of insanity. You are the keeper of a promise I failed to honor. And you are my mate." He dropped his hand, turning away again as if he couldn't bear to look at her, at what he had allowed to happen to her. "There is more," he said, his voice heavy. "The vow your hand sealed. It was more than a treaty. It was a promise from my father to yours. Your bloodline carries a gift, a form of sight, the ability to see truth, to cut through deception. It is a power that has always served and protected the Alpha's line. The pact was a promise that you, the last of that line, would be raised at the Alpha's side, your gift nurtured, to serve the pact." He gestured around the room, a sweep of his hand that encompassed his entire, lonely reign. "A gift I have sorely needed. I have ruled with iron and suspicion, because I could not see the hearts of the men around me. The peace I built is brittle because it is founded on fear, not trust. My father broke his vow by dying, and I broke it by forgetting." Verity sank into the nearest chair, her legs no longer able to support her. A dormant power, a broken vow, a mate she never knew she had. It was too much. Her entire life, the small, ordered world she had built for herself, had been a lie. A cage built on a forgotten promise. Would you have stayed when you learned your whole life was built on a forgotten promise? Would you have run, or would you have faced the man who held the truth? Tell me in the comments, and if you are not subscribed yet, join this family. Ronan watched her, his heart aching. He saw the confusion, the fear, the dawning anger in her eyes. He deserved all of it. The bond, he said softly, trying to explain the unexplainable. It awakens the gifts of the blood. Your power has been dormant because you were alone. Now that we are near, it will begin to surface. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and sharp, and for the first time he saw the steel of her ancestors looking back at him. "And what do you want from me, Ronan?" she asked, using his name without his title. It sent a shiver of pleasure and pain through him. "Do you want a truth-seer or a mate?" The question was a clean strike, straight to the heart of his own turmoil. For 30 years, he had been only the alpha. He had forgotten how to be the man. "I don't know," he answered, the admission costing him more than any lost battle. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I am. But my wolf has known what it wanted from the moment you spoke in that darkness. It wants you, safe, close. It wants to heal the wounds I inflicted." He knelt before her chair. The Alpha King, the Iron Wolf of the North, knelt on the floor before his forgotten scribe. He took her hands in his, not as an alpha claiming his mate, but as a penitent. "I cannot undo the last 10 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I cannot give you back the life you should have had, but I can give you the rest of mine. Stay here with me, not as a prisoner, but as whatever you choose to be. Help me, teach me how to be more than a weapon, and let me show you what it is to be cherished." Verity looked down at the great dark head bowed before her, at his strong hands holding hers so gently. She felt the hum of the bond, a deep, resonant pull in her soul. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was the truth. For the first time in her life, she was not invisible. She was seen. Completely and utterly seen by the one man who mattered most. And in that moment, she made a choice. Not for a forgotten vow, or a dormant power, or a king's regret. She made it for the man kneeling in the firelight, and for the woman he saw in her. "All right, Ronan," she whispered, her fingers tightening around his. "I will stay." The days that followed were a strange dream. Verity remained in the East Tower, a gilded cage that slowly began to feel like a sanctuary. Servants brought her food, new clothes of soft wool and silk that felt alien against her skin, and books from the real library. But it was Ronan's presence that defined her new world. He was a creature of fierce routine. He rose before dawn, trained with his guards in the yard below her window, and spent his days in endless meetings with his council. But every evening he came to her. At first, it was awkward. They would eat in silence at the large table in her rooms, the space between them charged with unspoken things. He would ask her about her day, and she would answer that she had read a book or watched the clouds from the window. He would tell her of a border dispute or a trade negotiation, his words clipped and formal. But Verity, the quiet keeper of records, was a master of observation. She began to see the man beneath the alpha. She saw the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, the weight of his crown in the slump of his shoulders when he thought she wasn't looking. One evening he came to her not with a tray of food, but with a stack of scrolls and maps, his face a mask of frustration. He threw them on the table. "It's Kaelin's son," he growled. "He wants a command of his own on the southern border." The boy is arrogant and untested, but Kaelin insists. How can I see the truth of it? Is it a father's pride or a strategic disaster in the making? Verity looked at the chaotic mess of papers. It reminded her of the archives before she had tamed them. Without a word, she rose and began to sort them, laying out the maps, stacking the reports, her nimble fingers bringing order to his chaos. He watched her, his annoyance slowly fading, replaced by a quiet fascination. "What are you doing?" "I am making it so you can see," she said simply. She placed a map of the southern border before him. "Here is the terrain. Here are the reports from the current commander. Here are the harvest yields from the villages the post protects. And here," she said, tapping a scroll, "is the training record of Kaelin's son." She didn't offer an opinion. She just presented the facts, clearly and concisely. She gave him the tools to see the truth for himself. He stared at the organized papers, then at her. A slow smile, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him, touched his lips. "You have a gift for this." "I organize things," she said with a small shrug. "It is what I do." From that night on, their evenings changed. He brought his work to her. She became his silent counsel, his confidant. She never told him what to do, but she would listen, her quiet presence a balm to his war-torn soul. And as she listened, something inside her began to shift. When Lord Bryce would propose a new tax, she would feel a prickle of unease, a sense of falsehood that she would quietly mention to Ronan. When a petition from a farming village seemed overly humble, she would feel a surge of genuine desperation from the parchment and urge him to look closer. Her dormant power was waking, not as a thunderclap, but as a soft, intuitive hum. The bond between them was the wire, and his problems were the current that flowed through it, awakening her senses. And the physical pull between them grew stronger each day. It was an ache in her chest when he was gone, a thrumming awareness whenever he was near. Sometimes, when he leaned over a map, his arm would brush hers, and the contact would leave her skin burning for hours. She became acutely aware of his scent, the way it filled the room, a promise of safety and danger all at once. One night, a storm raged outside, rattling the windows of the tower. Ronan was late. Verity found herself pacing, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. It was an unfamiliar feeling. In the archives, she had been alone but never lonely. Now his absence was a physical void. When he finally entered, he was soaked to the bone, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked utterly defeated. "The Silver Creeks are massing on the border," he said, his voice flat. "My meeting with their chieftain did not go well. He sees your presence at my side as a trick. He thinks I am using a low-born scribe to invalidate the pact and claim their lands." "He is a fool, then," Verity said, her voice sharp with a protectiveness that surprised her. Ronan looked at her, and she saw a raw vulnerability in his eyes that stole her breath. "Perhaps I am the fool. I bring you out of the darkness only to put you in the path of a new danger." He walked to the fire, stripping off his wet tunic and dropping it to the floor. The firelight played over the hard muscles of his back and chest, a landscape of old scars and new responsibilities. He was magnificent and terrible and achingly human. Verity went to the wardrobe and pulled out a thick, dry robe. She approached him hesitantly. "You will catch a chill." He turned, and they were closer than they had ever been. She had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. She held out the robe. He didn't take it. Instead, he lifted a hand and cupped her face, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. "Verity," he breathed, his golden eyes searching hers. "I am drowning, and you are the only solid ground I can find." The confession broke through the last of her reservations. This was not the Alpha King demanding his due. This was a man, lost and weary, reaching for his other half. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. "I am here, Ronan." That was all it took. With a low growl that was pure wolf, he lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a storm, a clash of lightning and thunder. It was 30 years of loneliness and a decade of longing, a forgotten vow and a rediscovered truth. It was desperate and hungry, and yet, underneath it all, impossibly tender. He tasted of rain and wood smoke and a fierce, possessive need that she answered with her own. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against his bare, wet chest. She could feel the wild thumping of his heart against hers, the heat of his skin, the controlled power in his embrace. She was not a fragile thing to be protected. She was his equal, his match, the missing piece of his soul. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, resting their foreheads against each other. "Mine," he growled, the word a possessive, primal claim that vibrated through her. And for the first time, the word did not feel like ownership. It felt like belonging. "Yours," she whispered back, and sealed her promise with another kiss. The whispers in the keep grew louder. The Alpha King was besotted, they said. He was being controlled by a low-born witch from the archives who had ensnared him with some dark magic. Lord Bryce, in particular, fanned these flames, his own position of influence threatened by Verity's quiet presence at Ronan's side. The Silver Creek pack, led by their hot-headed young chieftain, Phelan, refused to stand down. Phelan saw Ronan's new mate not as a sign of a rediscovered pact, but as an insult. He publicly declared that the Iron Wolf had gone soft, choosing a dusty scribe over a warrior queen. He demanded the Sunken Valley, not as a treaty right, but as a forfeiture for Ronan's perceived weakness. Verity felt the danger like a change in barometric pressure. Her gift was growing more potent every day. She could feel the waves of animosity from the court, the sharp edges of Bryce's deceit, the simmering violence from the Silver Creek camp. It was a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that left her drained. Ronan saw the toll it was taking. He saw the shadows under her eyes, the way she would startle at sudden noises. His rage was a cold, tightly coiled thing in his gut. They were hurting his mate, and for that, there could be no forgiveness. The attack came not from the front, but from within. One afternoon, Verity decided she needed a book from the main library. She had been cooped up in the tower for weeks, and the thought of being surrounded by different stories was a balm to her soul. She told the guards at her door, two of Ronan's most trusted wolves, where she was going. They were hesitant, but she was their Luna to be, and her quiet command was not to be denied. One of them, a young wolf named Galen, insisted on escorting her. The library was quieter than usual. As Verity browsed the shelves, a sense of deep unease settled over her. The feeling of being watched was a physical weight. Galen stood by the door, alert and tense. She found the book she was looking for, a collection of old northern poetry, and turned to leave. As she passed a secluded alcove, a hand shot out and grabbed her arm, yanking her into the shadows. Another hand clamped over her mouth. It was two of Lord Bryce's personal guards. Their eyes were hard, their grips like iron. "The Lord Bryce sends his regards," one of them hissed in her ear. "He says it's time the little scribe went back to her dust." Galen roared and charged, but a third man appeared from behind a bookshelf, slamming a heavy wooden chair into his back. Her guard went down with a sickening crack. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Verity. They were dragging her toward a small, rarely used postern gate at the back of the library. This was an abduction. They were going to spirit her out of the hold, to hand her over to the Silver Creeks, or worse. But alongside the panic, something else rose within her. A cold, clear rage. They had hurt her guard. They were trying to take her from her mate. They were threatening her pack. The hand over her mouth was slick with sweat. The man holding her smelled of sour ale and fear. He was afraid of Ronan's reprisal, but more afraid of disobeying Bryce. She focused on that fear, on the lie he was living. Her power, the truth sight, surged through her, no longer a gentle hum, but a deafening roar. She didn't know how she knew what to do. She just did. She stopped struggling and focused all her will on the man holding her. She locked eyes with him and spoke, her voice muffled by his hand. But the words did not need to be heard by the ears. They were a blade aimed at his heart. "You do this for a man who promised you your own lands. He lied. He will cast you aside the moment you are no longer useful. He thinks you are a dog." The guard flinched as if struck. His eyes widened in shock and terror. The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. His grip on her loosened. She twisted, stomping down hard on his instep with her heel. He howled and released her. The other guard lunged, but Verity was already moving. She grabbed a heavy, leather-bound book from a nearby table, a history of the Grey Fur Wars, and swung it with all her might into his face. The impact was solid and satisfying. He staggered back, clutching his broken nose. She didn't wait to see more. She ran. Not toward the main doors, but toward the open window at the far end of the library, the one that overlooked the training yard. She didn't scream for help. She didn't need to. She screamed one word, a name that was a prayer and a command. A call from one soul to another. "Ronan!" He was in the yard below, sparring with Kalen. He was a blur of motion, his practiced sword singing through the air. But at the sound of her voice, he froze. His head snapped up. He saw her at the window, her face pale, her eyes wide with fury and fear. And then he saw the guard with the bloody nose recovering and lunging for her. The change was instantaneous and terrifying. The man, the Alpha King, vanished. The wolf took over. A sound tore from his throat that was not human, a guttural, earth-shaking roar of pure, possessive fury. His eyes bled from gray to solid, blazing gold. He moved. He didn't use the stairs. He launched himself at the stone wall of the library, his powerful legs finding purchase in the rough-hewn rock. He moved with an inhuman speed and grace, a vertical sprint that defied gravity. He cleared the 20 feet to the window in seconds, flowing over the sill and into the library in a single, fluid motion. The guard who had lunged for Verity had just enough time for his eyes to widen in absolute terror before Ronan was on him. The Alpha's hand shot out, grabbing the man by the throat and lifting him off the floor. Bones crunched. The man made a gurgling sound and went limp. Ronan dropped him like a sack of grain and turned, his golden eyes scanning the room, his body thrumming with violence. He saw Galen, groaning and trying to rise. He saw the first guard, frozen in fear. And he saw Verity, standing beside the window, her chest heaving, a heavy book clutched in her hands like a weapon. He stalked toward her, his movements a predator's glide. He gently took the book from her hands and placed it on the table. Then his hands were on her, checking her for injury, his touch frantic and rough with adrenaline. "Did they hurt you?" he growled, his voice a low rumble. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'm all right." He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, breathing in her scent as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to sanity. "Mine," he growled into her hair. "You are mine, and no one touches what is mine." He held her for a long moment, his entire body trembling with the force of the rage he was holding back. Then he gently set her aside. He turned to face the quivering guard who was still standing, paralyzed with fear. "Whose man are you?" Ronan's voice was deadly quiet. The man, unable to speak, just shook his head, his eyes pleading. Ronan was beside him in a flash. He didn't touch him. He leaned in close, his golden eyes boring into the man's soul. "Tell me," he whispered. And Verity felt it. She felt Ronan's will, a crushing force of command, augmented by the bond. He was using his alpha power, not just as a king, but as a mate. And through him, her own power surged. The guard's defenses crumbled. "Lord Bryce," he whimpered. "It was Lord Bryce." A terrible, cold smile touched Ronan's lips. "I see." He turned to the other guards who were now pouring into the library, drawn by the commotion. "Take this filth to the cells," he commanded, gesturing to the two conscious attackers. "See to Galen, and send a summons to the Great Hall. Every lord, every lady, every member of the court. Now." He turned back to Verity, the inferno in his eyes banked but not extinguished. He held out his hand. "Come, my love. It is time we ended this." The great hall was packed. Every noble, every warrior, every servant who could fit was there, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. They had been summoned by the Alpha's rage, a force of nature none dared disobey. At the front of the hall, near the dais, stood a pale and sweating Lord Bryce, flanked by the members of his council, who now kept a careful distance from him. The Silver Creek chieftain, Phelan, was there as well, having been summoned from his camp under an armed guard that was more of an arrest than an escort. The heavy doors at the back of the hall swung open. Silence fell. Alpha King, Ronan entered. He was not wearing his crown or his ceremonial furs. He was dressed in the simple black tunic and breeches he had been training in, his practice sword still at his hip. The only sign of his rank was the raw, untamed power that radiated from him, a pressure that made the air thick and hard to breathe. But it was not him that drew every eye. It was the woman whose hand he held. Verity walked at his side, her head held high. She too was in a simple dress, her hair unbound. She was not a queen draped in jewels. She was a woman who had faced down her attackers and was now walking into the heart of the pack that had scorned her, her hand held by the one man who saw her true worth. They walked the length of the hall, the crowd parting before them like water. They did not stop at the dais. They stopped in the center of the floor, in the middle of everyone, equals among their people. Ronan released her hand and took a step forward, his gaze sweeping the room. "For 30 years, his voice began, low and resonant, carrying to every corner, I have ruled this pack with iron. I have kept the peace through strength. I have put duty before all else, before myself, before my heart, before my honor." His eyes landed on Lord Bryce. "I trusted others to be honorable. I trusted my council to care for the least of my people. I trusted that the orphan of a great house would be treated with the respect she was owed." He turned his gaze to Verity, and his voice softened, filled with a pain that was more damning than any anger. In this, I failed. I allowed the daughter of the House of Scribes, the last of her line, to be hidden from me. I allowed her to be forgotten. I broke a vow made by my father, a vow sealed by this very woman's hand as a child. He looked back at the crowd. And when the bond of a mated pair, a bond blessed by the great wolf himself, revealed her to me, you whispered. You called her a witch, a lowborn. You sought to poison my mind against the other half of my soul. His voice dropped, becoming a deadly whisper. And one of you, he said, his eyes locking on Bryce again, dared to lay hands on her. Lord Bryce fell to his knees. My king, I swear, it is a misunderstanding. There is no misunderstanding. Ronan's voice cracked like a whip. There is only truth, and my mate, she sees the truth. He looked at Verity, a silent question. She stepped forward, her fear gone, replaced by a calm certainty. This was her purpose, not just to be his mate, but to be his partner, his truth-seer. She looked at Bryce not with anger, but with a deep, sorrowful clarity. You were afraid, she said, her voice clear and strong. You were afraid that my presence would expose the lands you have stolen, the treaties you have twisted for your own gain, the lies you have told the Alpha King for a decade. Every word was a nail in Bryce's coffin. The other lords shifted, their own small guilts rising to the surface. Then Verity turned her clear, unwavering gaze to the Silver Creek chieftain. And you, Phelan, you do not want the sunken valley. You want to avenge your father, who you believe was cheated in the peace 30 years ago. You see weakness in our Alpha because you are blind by your own grief. You are trying to start a war to quiet the ghosts in your own heart. Phelan staggered back as if she had struck him, his face ashen. The truth of it, spoken so plainly, disarmed him completely. The hall was utterly silent, every person caught in the power of her words. Verity had not just spoken, she had revealed. Ronan stepped back to her side, taking her hand again, their fingers lacing together. This is my mate, he declared to the silent hall, his voice booming with pride and possession. Verity of the House of Scribes, my Luna, my truth, my queen. An attack on her is an attack on me. An insult to her is an insult to this entire pack. Her word is my word. Her judgment is my judgment. He drew his sword, not in anger, but in ceremony. He held it aloft. Let any who dispute this claim speak now or forever hold their peace. No one spoke, no one dared. They were not just looking at their Alpha King. They were looking at a completed whole. The Iron Wolf and his quiet, seeing mate. The perfect balance of strength and truth. Ronan sheathed his sword. He looked at Bryce, still kneeling and trembling on the floor. You are stripped of your lands and titles. You will spend the rest of your days in the cells, thinking on the true meaning of loyalty. He then looked to Phelan. You will honor the pact your father signed, and you will send a tithe of grain to our stores for 5 winters as penance for your foolishness. We will have peace. He then turned to Verity, his eyes for all the world to see, full of nothing but love. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. Let's go home, he murmured, for her alone. And he led her from the hall, leaving a stunned, silent, and irrevocably changed pack in their wake. 1 year later, Verity stood on the balcony of the East Tower, looking out over the moonlit valley. The air was crisp with the coming autumn, and the sounds of the hold settling down for the night were a peaceful murmur below. The door opened behind her. She didn't have to turn. She felt him, a warm, solid presence that was as familiar to her now as her own heartbeat. Ronan came to stand beside her, wrapping his arms around her from behind and pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his breath warm against her neck. "The council was restless tonight," he murmured. "They are still not used to their Luna Queen knowing they are considering skimming profits before they even propose the trade route." Verity leaned back into him, a soft smile on her face. "Let them be restless. It keeps them honest." Her life was unrecognizable from what it had been. She was no longer a ghost in the archives, but a respected and sometimes feared presence in the court. Her quiet insights had helped Ronan navigate a dozen conflicts, strengthening the pack from the inside out. The peace they had was no longer brittle. It was resilient, built now on trust and truth. But it was in these quiet moments, alone with him, that she felt most herself. "You are happy?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against her back. It was a question he still asked often, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. She turned in his arms to face him, wrapping her own around his neck. She looked into his eyes, no longer just gray or gold, but a complex mixture of both, warm and deep. She saw the Alpha King, the Iron Wolf, the fierce protector. But she also saw Ronan, her Ronan, the man who still brought her his troubles, who listened to her thoughts on poetry, who fell asleep with his head in her lap before the fire. "I was not unhappy in the archives," she said softly, truthfully. "I had my books and my silence. I had found a way to exist." She reached up and traced the lines of his face, the hard jaw, the scar above his brow. "I did not know what it was to live," she whispered, "until you." He lowered his head, and his kiss was not the desperate clash of their first embrace, nor the public declaration in the great hall. It was a slow, deep, and tender conversation, a testament to 1,000 shared nights and 1,000,000 quiet moments. It was the kiss of two souls who had found their home in each other. "I love you, Verity," he murmured against her lips. "I know," she smiled. "I saw it in your heart the moment you knelt before me." For more stories where being truly seen conquers a lifetime of invisibility, and where quiet strength becomes a queen's power, subscribe to His Wolf Knew First. So tell me, would you have stayed? Comment where you are listening from tonight. I stay up until my eyes burn to bring you these stories. If this one touched you, do not break my heart. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.